My son's words still ring in my ears like a slammed door. You got 2 hours to pack and go. I've already changed the locks. No hesitation, no regret, just a cold executive tone from the boy I'd once taught to hammer his first nail. I'm Lionel, 68 years old, and every plank in that old Portland house had passed through my hands. I'd laid the foundation myself back when my late wife, Lila, was pregnant with our only child, Mark. For 40 years, we'd turned that place into a home. Birthdays, anniversaries, quiet nights by the fire, and long Saturdays in the workshop behind the house where I carved furniture and Lila read on a stool nearby. Now I stood in the same workshop, staring at my son in a designer suit. His new wife, Tessa, posed behind him like she was in a glossy magazine, lips tight with impatience. This is my house, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. Our house. I built it before you were even thought of. Mark didn't flinch. It's in my name now. We refinanced and consolidated everything for the business, remember? I'm responsible for the mortgage, the insurance, the taxes. Tessa and I need privacy. We want to start a family. You stumbling around this place isn't part of that plan. I felt the floor tilt under me. We'd signed those papers years ago, Lila and I, thinking we were helping him grow his tech company. We trusted him completely. You could have talked to me. I managed, giving me time. He checked his watch. I did. For months. You just didn't listen. 2 hours, Dad. Take what you can carry. I'll have a storage unit arranged for anything else. Then, like a knife in the ribs, he added, and don't try to come back tonight. The locks are already changed. When the front door finally shut behind him, the workshop fell silent except for the faint ticking of the clock and the rasp in my chest. I sat on the old stool where Lila used to sit, tracing the grooves she'd worn with her fingers, trying to understand how the boy we'd raised on honesty and hard work had turned into someone who would throw his father out like unwanted furniture. 2 hours later, I was standing on the sidewalk with a single worn duffel bag. 40 years of life reduced some clothes, a few tools, and a bundle of photographs. October wind cut through my flannel shirt as lights glowed warmly in windows that no longer belonged to me. My wallet felt too light. When I opened it under the street lamp, a few crumpled bills. Not much else. Then my fingers brushed something buried deep inside a slot I rarely used. A faded teal debit card with my wife's name on it, Lila Rowan. My heart clenched. She died 3 years earlier, leaving a hole no one could fill. I'd forgotten she even had a separate card. She used to joke about her little nest eggs, small savings from quilting, gardening gigs, and clipping coupons like it was a sport. I'd always assumed those tiny amounts went right back into the household. I stood there under that weak streetlight, turning the card over my calloused hands. The plastic was worn, numbers half rubbed off from years of friction. There's probably nothing on it, I muttered. Maybe enough for one more night in a motel. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Lila was nudging me from somewhere I couldn't see. She'd always been 10 steps ahead, reading fine print and thinking about tomorrow when I was still stuck in today. That night in the cheap motel, staring at a stained ceiling and listening to trucks roar past on the freeway, I held that card flat on my chest like a lifeline. Mark had my house, my tool shed, my savings, even the old truck title tied to the company loans. All I had left was this forgotten sliver of plastic tied to the woman who'd never once let me fall, without planning a way to catch me. By morning, I'd made up my mind. With the duffel over my shoulder and the card tucked safely in my wallet, I headed to the only place I could still imagine hope living, the downtown bank whose logo was stamped on that teal rectangle. I walked through those glass doors expecting a humiliating zero balance and maybe a sympathetic look from some young teller. Instead, the moment he tapped a few keys and saw the screen, his face drained of color. He swallowed hard, glanced at me and whispered, "Sir, I need to get my manager. You might want to sit down for this." If you were in my shoes standing at that counter, what would you be hoping to hear from that manager? Stay with this story and hit that subscribe button, because what my wife had been hiding from me for 30 years was about to turn my whole world upside down. To the branch manager introduced herself as Rachel Price, a calm woman in a navy blazer whose eyes betrayed more excitement than her professional smile. Mr. Rowan, would you mind stepping into my office? She asked, already holding my forgotten teal card like it was made of crystal. My stomach twisted. I'd half convinced myself the account was overdrawn or flagged as dormant, and they were about to scold me for dragging an old card back from the dead. I followed Rachel past cubicles to a glass-walled office that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. The young teller who'd helped me hovered just outside, sneaking glances. Rachel closed the door gently and gestured to a chair. "First, I'm very sorry for your loss," she said. "Our records show your wife, Lila, passed away 3 years ago." I nodded, throat tight. Cancer. She handled most of the bills near the end. I was working as much as I could with the shop. Rachel turned her monitor so I could see. Rows of numbers filled the screen. Columns labeled accounts, portfolios, trusts. My brain, trained to measure boards and angles, struggled to understand what I was seeing. "Mr. Rowan," she said carefully, "this card is attached to a master account that's been categorized under our private wealth division. It was structured as a legacy trust with specific instructions. Private wealth." I almost laughed. "Ma'am, I'm a carpenter. My wife made quilts and grew tomatoes. We drove the same truck for 15 years. Rachel's expression softened, but her voice stayed firm. "Sometimes people who seem the most modest are the ones planning the farthest ahead. Your wife was. Very smart." She clicked a few more keys, and one figure enlarged on the screen, dwarfing all the rest. A balance. It didn't look like a real number to me, more like something from a newspaper headline about lottery winners or tech billionaires. My vision blurred. There were commas everywhere, zeros stretching across the screen. "You're missing a decimal," I croaked. "Or a few." "No, sir, that's correct," she said. "Your wife built this over multiple accounts. Blue chip stocks, tech companies, index funds, real estate investment trusts. She structured it so the funds will remain largely hidden until certain conditions were met." I gripped the arms of the chair, knuckles whitening. Lila, in her worn cardigans and gardening gloves, had quietly built a fortune while I worried about lumber prices. She never told me. I whispered. "We scraped to pay Mark's college tuition. I picked up extra jobs." Why didn't she say anything? Rachel hesitated, then clicked another tab. "There's one more thing. When we confirmed your identity, the system flagged a note. Your wife left something in our vault for you. A sealed letter, to be released only when this account was accessed by you alone." My heart stopped for a long, empty beat. "A letter?" "Yes. Sir, if you like, we can retrieve it now." We descended into the cool belly of the bank where metal doors and numbered boxes lined the walls. Rachel used a key and a fingerprint scanner, then slid out a small safety deposit box. Inside, nestled next to an old photograph of Lila and me on our wedding day, was a thick envelope sealed in deep red wax. My name was on the front in her tidy, looping handwriting. "Take whatever time you need," Rachel said, leaving me alone in the small viewing room. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Lila's scent seemed to rise from the paper, lavender and sawdust and laundry detergent. "My stubborn Lionel," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means 2 things. 1, I'm no longer there to nag you about eating your vegetables. And 2, you must be desperate enough to use the card you never asked about." I had to stop, wiping my eyes on my sleeve. Her voice poured out of those pages as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. She wrote about late nights at the kitchen table while I slept, teaching herself about mutual funds and tech companies, reading business pages until her eyes hurt. She reminded me of all the time she joked about her tiny side investments from quilt sales and coupon savings. "You laughed, called them my hobby dollars," she wrote. "But I was watching the world change. While you built furniture that would last, I tried to build a safety net that could catch us if life ever pushed us off a cliff." Then her tone shifted, growing heavier. She wrote about Mark, about the way his eyes had started to shine more for numbers than for people, how he'd begun talking about leveraging assets instead of honoring them. She'd seen a hunger in him that I dismissed as youthful ambition. "I need you to understand what this money is for, Lionel," she wrote. "It's not a prize. It's a tool, a shield, and I'm afraid one day you'll need it to protect yourself from the boy we raised. I sat there in that little room, the air feeling thinner with every line. My wife had spent 30 years quietly building a secret fortress because she'd seen a storm I refused to acknowledge. At the bottom of the letter, she'd written one more line that burned itself into my mind. If Mark ever turns our love into numbers on a balance sheet, promise me you'll use this gift to protect what's right, not to get even. As I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest, one thought cut through the shock like a knife. If Lila had planned this much, what else had she seen coming? And how far had our son already fallen? Before you decide what you do with a hidden fortune like that, imagine discovering your child might be the danger it was meant to guard against. Would you protect them or protect everyone else from them? Keep listening, because the way I chose to use Lila's secret would change my family forever. I walked out of that bank with my world turned inside out. Less than 24 hours earlier, I'd been a broke, displaced carpenter with nowhere to go. Now, on paper, I was the kind of man people wrote articles about. But all I felt was hollow. Lila's letter stayed in my jacket, its weight heavier than the New Balance the manager had whispered to me like a confession. "We can arrange a financial advisor," she'd said. "A private banker. Estate planning. Philanthropy. Philanthropy." The words sounded wrong in my ears while I was still nursing the bruise of Mark's last words to me. I didn't care about yachts or second homes. I cared that my son had looked me in the eye and decided I was an inconvenience. Back at the motel, I spread Lila's letter out on the bed and reread the section that kept stabbing at me. I saw it in Mark's face, the way he looked at our house like a line item instead of a home, the way he talked about what he'd do with everything when we were gone. You called it drive. I called it danger. She'd written about overhearing conversations I'd shrugged off. Mark talking about tapping equity and streamlining dead assets while Lila washed dishes in the next room. Him complaining that I wouldn't retire and let him modernize my workshop property. Our boy learned how to measure success in numbers, not in hands shaken or work well done, she wrote. I pray I'm wrong. But if I'm not, this money is here, so you have options when he backs you into a corner. Well, he'd literally shut the door in my face. I stare at the stained motel wallpaper, trying to reconcile the kid I'd taught to sand his first chair with a man who'd given me a 12-hour eviction notice. Was this just a fight taken too far, or a symptom of something rotten Lila had seen years ago? One way or another, I needed the truth. And truth, in my experience, is rarely handed to you. You have to go looking for it with both hands. The next day, I went back to the bank, not to check the account, but to ask Rachel for something more valuable than a withdrawal. I need a recommendation, I told her. Someone who can look into a company. Quietly, her eyebrows rose. Investigate? May I ask why? Because my son runs a tech firm that suddenly has my house tied to it, I said. And my wife was worried enough about him to build a secret financial bunker. I can't ignore that anymore. She studied my face, then nodded slowly and slid a business card across the desk. This gentleman is a client of ours. Ex-law enforcement. He's helped several of our customers with sensitive corporate matters. You can get his name from me. The card read, Daniel Cole, Investigations and Risk Consulting. Former federal agent. Discreet. I called a number from a payphone. Old habits die hard. And by that afternoon, I was sitting across from Daniel in a small office overlooking the river. He was in his 50s, lean, with watchful eyes and a notebook he flipped open the second I sat down. You understand my work isn't cheap, he said. I'm not looking for cheap. I replied, I'm looking for honest. That seemed to pass some internal test. Tell me about your son. I told him everything. The house, the locks, the new wife with the icy smile, the papers Lila had signed before she died, the letter she'd left in the bank. I handed over a copy of the evidence Rachel had printed about Lila's investments, not because it mattered to the investigation itself, but because it explained why I could afford to be sitting in that chair. Daniel listened without interrupting, occasionally scribbling notes. When I finished, he tapped his pen thoughtfully. Digital firm, right? Software consulting cloud services. That's what he says. I answered, I don't speak that language. I speak lumber and square footage. Do you have the company name? I gave it to him, along with everything I knew. Their address downtown, the glossy brochure Mark had once proudly shoved into my hands, the list of big-name clients he bragged about over dinners I now realize had been performances. What are you afraid we'll find? Daniel asked. I swallowed hard. I'm afraid my wife was right, and my son's been building something that looks impressive on the outside and hollow on the inside. And I'm afraid other people will get hurt when it finally collapses. Daniel leaned back. We'll start with public records, lawsuits, liens, complaints, regulatory filings. Then we'll talk to former staff, vendors, maybe a few clients. If there's smoke, we'll find the fire. As I stood to leave, he added quietly, I need to warn you, Mr. Rowan. When you hire someone like me to look into family, you have to be ready to hear things you won't like. Once you know, you can't unknow. I thought of Lila's delicate handwriting, of the way she'd seen danger in our son's ambition long before I did. I've lived long enough to know that pretending everything is fine doesn't save anyone, I said. Find me the truth, whatever it costs. I walked out of Daniel's office with my heart pounding and my hands shaking, not from fear of losing money, but from fear of losing whatever was left of my son. If an investigator showed you that the child you love was hurting people for profit, could you still do what's right? In the next part, you'll hear exactly what we uncovered inside my son's shiny tech empire, and it's worse than anything I imagined. For the first call from Daniel came 3 days later, just after dawn. I was nursing a motel coffee, so we could taste it like hot water pretending to be brave. Mr. Rowan, he said, we need to meet. There are patterns you should see with your own eyes. Patterns. That word never meant anything good in a detective's mouth. His office was spread with printed emails, public filings, and notes from interviews. It looked like someone had torn the glossy brochure from my son's company into pieces and scattered the truth underneath. Let's start with the easy part, Daniel said, tapping a spreadsheet. Client list. Your son has worked with some respectable names, regional banks, medical groups, manufacturing firms. That part checks out. So, he built something real, I said, relieved. He did, Daniel agreed. But then he started hollowing it out. He pointed to another column. In the last 12 months, 3 major clients terminated their contracts early and demanded partial refunds, not because of normal delays or disagreements, because they claimed services were never delivered as promised. He pushed a folder toward me. Inside were copies of termination letters and complaint emails. Phrases like breach of contract, misrepresentation of capabilities, and failure to deliver critical systems jumped off the page. One letter from a regional health network described paying a large upfront fee for a custom patient management system that never materialized. Another from a small bank detailed buying advanced security software that turned out to be a cheap, repackaged product anyone could download. Sometimes projects just go bad. I said weakly, maybe he overextended. Daniel flipped to a stack of internal emails from former employees. That's what I thought at first. Until I started talking to people who used to work for him. The stories followed the same pattern. Mark promising the moon to clients, AI-driven platforms, custom apps, bulletproof security, then scrambling to cobble together something basic with minimal cost. When deadlines loomed, he'd pressure staff to fudge progress reports, pad timesheets, and send mock-ups as if they were functioning products. He encouraged employees to lie. I asked, my voice brittle, directed them to, Daniel said, here. He showed me an email where Mark wrote, tell them version 1 is almost ready. Use the demo screens. We just need another 60 days and their full payment. They won't know the difference. My chest tightened. That wasn't a miscommunication. That was deliberate deception. It gets worse, Daniel continued gently. Your son's been using incoming client payments as his personal piggy bank. Luxury car leases, a country club membership, lavish trips. Meanwhile, vendors go unpaid for months. He laid out bank statements, showing money flowing in from contracts and flowing out just as quickly to travel agencies, jewelry stores, and high-end boutiques. I recognized some charges. The honeymoon to Bora Bora he'd bragged about, the imported wine he'd pushed me to taste at dinner once. Mark told me investors were backing his growth. I murmured, staring at the columns of numbers, said he was reinvesting everything in the company. Investors, Daniel repeated, pulling out one last folder. That's where this crosses from unethical into criminal. These documents showed polished pitch decks Mark had sent to potential backers, glossy charts, inflated revenue numbers, fake projections. He'd listed contracts that had already been canceled as active and showed profits where there were only debts. Attached were audited financial statements that, according to a forensic accountant Daniel had consulted, were full of manufactured figures. This isn't just optimistic picture, Daniel said quietly. This is fraud. Wire fraud, investor fraud. He's lying on official documents and moving money under false pretenses. In one email to his wife, Mark had even joked, if these investors buy in on this deck, they deserve to lose their money. I'm basically selling them faith and buzzwords. My hands shook so badly I had to set the paper down. I thought of the boy who used to sit in my workshop, tongue sticking out as he tried to drive a nail straight. So proud when I told him a job well done meant you could sleep at night. How had that boy turned into a man who saw trust as an opportunity to exploit? How deep is he? I asked. Daniel's answer was a number so big it made my own new fortune feel like a cruel mirror. In total liabilities, about $2.5 million, behind on payments to the bank that holds his main line of credit. If those loans get called, the company collapses, clients lose money. Employees lose jobs. Investors get burned. I stared out Daniel's window at the river moving steadily past the city, carrying everything with it, whether it was ready or not. So what are my options? I asked slowly. I can turn him in. I can run. Or, Daniel said carefully, you can take control before the bank or the government does. You have resources. You could buy his debt, become his main creditor. That would give you leverage to clean up the mess and protect his victims while deciding what happens to him. I thought of Lila's words. This money is a tool, not a prize. A shield, not a trophy. If you had to choose between protecting your child from consequences or protecting everyone he hurt, where would you land? Daniel asked. I didn't answer right away. The truth is, no parent should ever be forced to weigh their blood against their conscience. But that's exactly where I found myself. If you discover your own child was cheating, lying, and stealing on this scale, would you cover for them or make sure everyone they hurt was made whole? In the next part, you'll hear how I use my wife's hidden fortune in a way she probably never imagined, by quietly buying a company my son thought he owned. Daniel didn't specialize in corporate takeovers, so he introduced me to someone who did, a gray-haired attorney named Victor Hale, who'd spent 4 decades navigating the ugly marriages and divorces of business, debt, and desperation. His office smelled like leather and old coffee, with degrees crowding the walls and a view of the very glass tower where my son's company rented 2 floors. So, Victor said, steepling his fingers as I finished my story, your son built a house of cards, and now the wind's picking up. You want to catch it before it blows all over town. I want his clients made whole, I replied. I want his employees to keep their jobs if they're not part of the lying. But I don't want to hand him a free pass either. Victor nodded slowly. Under ordinary circumstances, the bank would eventually call his line of credit, seize whatever assets the company has, auction them off, and leave everyone fighting over scraps. But these aren't ordinary circumstances. You have enough liquidity to become the bank. Become the bank. Buy his debt, Victor explained. Loans are assets to banks, but unpopular ones get sold all the time, especially when the borrower looks shaky. You create an entity, say, Rowan Holdings, LLC, and quietly purchase the notes from the bank at a discount. The moment you do, your company becomes your son's main creditor. In effect, you own him more than he owns his own business. The thought made me both nauseous and grimly focused. Using Lila's hidden fortune to buy the very chains wrapped around our son felt like something out of a twisted parable. Would Mark know? I asked. Not immediately. Victor said, these deals often happen behind closed doors. To him, it will still be the bank breathing down his neck until you decide to show your face. Over the next few days, Victor moved with the kind of speed that only comes when money speaks clearly. He formed Rowan Summit Holdings in my name, drafted confidentiality agreements, and arranged a meeting with the commercial lending department at the same bank holding my son's loans. I sat quietly in a tailored suit their staff had insisted I buy. Apparently wealthy men are expected to look like it, while Victor did the talking. The bank's risk officer looked relieved when he saw the offer. Digital Dynamics has been on our watch list for months, he admitted. They're behind on payments. Their financials don't match their supposed growth. And frankly, we don't want a headache of dealing with a messy default. They agreed to sell Mark's loans at a significant discount, happy to turn a potential problem into immediate cash. To them, it was just another line item resolved. To me, it was taking responsibility for a storm my family had brewed. When I signed the last document and the wire transfer cleared, Victor slid a slim folder across the table. "Congratulations," he said. "As of right now, Rowan Summit Holdings is the primary secured creditor of Digital Dynamics. That effectively gives you control. And if you convert that debt to equity, you own the majority of the company." It took me a moment to process the words. A week ago, my son had thrown me out of a house he believed he controlled. Today, without his knowledge, I held the papers that could remove him from the throne he'd built out of borrowed money and stolen trust. Back at Victor's office, we signed a final stack of forms converting most of the debt into shares, leaving a smaller portion as an active obligation. This way, Victor explained, you hold 70+% of the company, enough to replace management, restructure operations, and decide how to handle the fraud. You're not just holding a leash. You own the dog. I stared at the ownership certificate, a simple document with my name, the company name, and a percentage that represented far more than stock. It represented a choice. I could quietly liquidate everything, pay off the damaged clients, and disappear from Mark's life forever. Or I could confront him, make him look in the face of what he'd done, and give him one last chance to stand up like the man I tried to raise. "What would you do?" I asked Victor. He shrugged. "I've seen parents bankrupt themselves bailing out their kids, and others press charges without blinking. Only you know what you can live with. But whatever you decide, do it with your eyes open. This paper makes you powerful. Power can clean a mess or make a bigger one." That night, I sat on a park bench across from the tower where my son worked late into the evening, lights glowing in his corner office. Did he have any idea the bank had sold his debts that afternoon? That the man he discarded like an old tool now held the strings of his entire empire? Lila's letter crinkled as I clutched it in my pocket, her words echoing. "Use this gift to protect our legacy, not to let greed win." I knew then what I had to do. Protect his victims, protect our name, and force my son to face the truth in a way he couldn't spin or excuse. "I want a meeting," I told Victor the next morning. "Arrange it like I'm just another potential investor. Let him think salvation is walking in the door. Then I'll show him who actually owns his company." Imagine being called into the biggest pitch meeting of your life, thinking you're about to rescue your business, only to find your father sitting at the head of the table holding papers that prove he owns everything you thought was yours. That's what I had planned for Mark. In the next part, you'll be in the room when we finally face each other, not as father and son, but as a man who built with his hands and a man who built with lies. 6, a conference room where it happened had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view meant to impress investors. I arrived early with Victor and Daniel, taking the chair at the head of the table. The receptionist had been told a representative from Rowan Summit Holdings would be evaluating a significant strategic partnership. Mark had no idea that name, and mine were the same. I positioned myself with my back to the door, facing the city lights. The weight of Lila's letter felt like a second spine running up my back, holding me upright when my knees wanted to buckle. I heard Mark before I saw him, the confident cadence of his voice, polished from years of pitching. "Gentlemen, I can assure you Digital Dynamics is positioned for aggressive growth. We're just looking for the right partner to." He stepped into the room, briefcase in hand, expensive watch glinting. When he saw the back of my head at the table's end, he faltered. "Sir," he started, then I turned. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the city below. His face drained of color. his polished CO mask cracking like cheap veneer. "Dad," he whispered. The briefcase slipped from his hand, paper spilling across the table. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down, Mark. We have business to discuss." "This isn't funny," he snapped, recovering some of his edge. "Rowan Summit is a serious firm. They're considering a major investment. You can't just—" I slid the ownership documents across the table, the new share certificates on top, along with the assignment of debt from a bank. "Rowan Summit Holdings," I said quietly, "is me." He glanced down, eyes scanning the legal language. The color rushed back to his face in hot, blotchy patches. No, that's not possible. The bank would have told me. They can't just sell my loans without... They can... Victor, cut in. And they did. Your debt is now owed to Rowan Summit Holdings, which converted most of it into equity. As of last Friday, your father owns 78% of Digital Dynamics. Mark looked from Victor to me and back again like he was trying to wake up from a bad dream. "You're a carpenter," he hissed at last. "You don't have this kind of money. You don't even understand what we do here. This is some kind of scam." "Your mother understood more than you ever gave her credit for," I replied softly. "She built something bigger than your company while you weren't paying attention, and she left it to me with instructions for what to do if you ever turned our home into a leverage point." I opened Daniel's thick folder of evidence. Termination letters, falsified reports, bank statements showing client funds diverted to personal luxuries, doctored pitch decks. I spread them across the glossy table, like warped blueprints. "I wanted to believe you were just struggling," I said, "that the house, the loans, the pressure had pushed you too hard. But this isn't a mistake, Mark. This is a pattern." He tried to rally, reaching for his old charm. "Dad, you don't understand how startups work. Everyone pushes projections. Everyone plays with numbers. It's about vision. Long term. I snapped, my palm hitting the table harder than I meant. The windows rattled faintly. "You took upfront payments from a health network that needed systems to help real people. You sold a bank fake security while bragging about being untouchable. You use your clients like an ATM to pay for champagne and beaches while sending them unfinished code." His jaw clenched. "You think you're some hero walking in here with a checkbook? You've never taken a risk like I have. You spent your life in a shed making chairs while I built something that matters. What you built," I said evenly, "is a tower made of stolen trust. And I own that tower now. I didn't come here to save you from the wind, Mark. I came here to decide whether I should knock the whole thing down or try to rebuild it before it crushes anyone else." For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes that wasn't about money. It was about losing control. "What do you want?" he asked, voice smaller. "You want me to resign? Fine. Take the company. I'll start another. Just don't ruin my name." I studied him carefully. In that moment, Lila's words came back to me. Don't let him destroy what we built together, but don't let greed win, either. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "I'm going to bring in auditors and fix what can be fixed. Every client you cheated will get their money back or the product they were promised. Employees who weren't part of this mess will stay. Those who will go." "And me?" he asked. "You have a choice," I replied. "You can cooperate, fully sign over day-to-day control, help us unravel this, be honest with investigators when they come. Or you can keep pretending this is all a misunderstanding and meet the people who handle fraud on a federal level. Either way, the truth will come out." He stared at me, eyes darting to the documents, the city, the door. "You wouldn't turn your own son in," he said finally, more hope than certainty. I thought of the clients Daniel had interviewed, small business owners on the edge, a clinic delaying upgrades because they'd been cheated, employees using savings to cover debts Mark had created. "I already turned myself in," I said, "the day I decided not to look away. This isn't about punishing you, Mark. It's about stopping the damage. I'll give you 24 hours to decide whether you want to walk into that process, standing beside me, or watch it happen from the back of a courtroom." He didn't answer. He just stared at the papers, as if he could will the ink to rearrange itself. I left the folder and walked out of the company my son used to run, knowing the next move wasn't his anymore. If your child stood on the edge of a cliff they built themselves, would you pull them back or let gravity teach the lesson? In the next part, you'll see what happens when family loyalty collides with federal law. Because the next office I walked into had 3 letters on the door. FBI. 7, the federal building was all sharp angles and thick glass, designed to make you feel small before you even went through the scanner. The sign out front read Federal Bureau of Investigation. But the weight of those words didn't hit me until I was sitting in a windowless conference room, Daniel's evidence folder on the table between us. Across from me sat Special Agent Nora Castillo, mid-40s, eyes like searchlights and a legal pad already half full of notes. Mr. Rowan, she said, Mr. Cole's given us an overview, but I want to hear it in your own words. Start from when your son threw you out of your home. I told her everything. The locks, the house in his name, the forgotten card, Lila's hidden fortune, the investigator's findings, the debt purchase, the confrontation. Saying it all in one sitting made the story feel unreal, like I was narrating someone else's life. Agent Castillo listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for dates, amounts, names. When I finished, she flipped through Daniel's documents briskly. This is thorough, she said. Client complaints, falsified financials, bank records. Enough to justify opening a formal case. My stomach nodded. If I cooperate fully, I asked, can we protect his clients? His employees. Our priority is always victims, she replied. That includes making sure innocent staff aren't collateral damage. But your son is facing serious exposure here. Wire fraud, securities fraud, bank fraud. We're talking years in federal prison if a judge isn't feeling generous. The words years in prison felt like ice in my bloodstream. I thought of Mark as a boy, standing proudly beside the first crooked birdhouse we'd built together. Is there any path? I asked, voice rough, where he takes responsibility and still has a life left to rebuild afterward. Agent Castillo considered me for a long moment. Jurisdiction and sentencing are up to prosecutors and judges, not me, she said. But cooperation matters. Early, honest cooperation can mean fewer charges or lighter recommendations. If he chooses to keep lying, he'll face the full weight of what he's done. That choice will be his. I nodded slowly. Then give me whatever forms you need signed. I said, I'm not here to shield him. I'm here to make sure the people he hurt get justice. If there's any mercy left over for him, he'll have to earn it. Over the next week, my life became a blur of meetings, signatures, and explanations. Forensic accountants swarmed digital dynamics books under the authority of subpoenas. Agents quietly interviewed former employees and clients, cross-checking everything in Daniel's file with independent sources. The more they dug, the worse it looked. Misclassified revenue, hidden losses, fake client references, quiet payoffs. Mark's beautiful pitch deck had been a work of fiction from cover to cover. When the charges were finally drafted, Agent Castillo laid them out for me in that same conference room. Mail and wire fraud for misrepresenting services and soliciting investment, she said. Bank fraud for lying on loan applications. Conspiracy counts if we can prove others knowingly helped. I stared at the neatly typed pages. Each line another nail in the coffin of the life my son had built. How will it happen? I asked. The arrest? Discreetly if possible, she said. We'll aim to pick him up at his office. Limit the public spectacle. But cases like this draw attention. They did. 2 mornings later, news helicopters buzzed over downtown as agents in jackets with big yellow letters walked my son out of his own building in handcuffs. Reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes popped. A red banner scrolled across local TV. Tech CEO charged in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. I watched from a block away, hidden behind a line of trees, feeling something I can only describe as heartbreak mixed with grim inevitability. This was a revenge. It was the bill coming due. The clients he'd hurt would finally be heard. The employees he'd pressured into lying could tell the truth. And my son, for the first time in years, wouldn't be able to spin his way out. The months that followed were slow and brutal. The government moved methodically. Mark's lawyers tried to argue he was just an overenthusiastic entrepreneur whose ambitions outpaced his execution. But every time they painted him as a dreamer who'd stumbled, the prosecutors countered with another email, another falsified report, another bank transfer to his personal accounts labeled consulting fee or miscellaneous bonus. I sat through the hearings and, eventually, the trial, always in the back row. I saw former clients testify about delayed projects that had cost them customers, security gaps that left systems vulnerable, clinics that postponed critical upgrades because he'd tied up their funds. Some spoke through tears. Others through clenched teeth. When it was the government's turn to present evidence, they used Daniel's investigation as a roadmap and expanded on it. Each document projected on the courtroom screen felt like a snapshot of the moment my son chose shortcuts over integrity. When the jury filed back in after deliberations, the air in the room turned heavy. The foreperson stood, hands trembling slightly, and began reading the verdicts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each word landed like a hammer. The judge, an older woman with more patience than I could fathom, looked directly at Mark as she spoke. "You didn't just cheat numbers on a page," she said. "You undermined trust in systems people rely on for their health, their security, their livelihoods." She sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison and ordered restitution to the tune of nearly $2 million. I watched my son's shoulders collapse as marshals led him away. No cameras this time, just a heavy silence. I went home that night to the small apartment I'd rented and sat alone with Lila's letter spread on the table. The clients would be made whole. I'd already instructed Victor to use Lila's fortune to cover whatever the restitution orders didn't. The company would be wound down responsibly. The damage was contained. But none of that made it easier to fall asleep knowing my boy was behind steel doors. If justice meant watching your own child in chains, would you still choose it? In the next part, you'll find out what happened 6 months later, when a letter with my son's prison return address forced me to decide whether punishment was enough or whether there was still room in all this for mercy. 6 months after the sentencing, an envelope arrived with stiff, institutional paper and my son's name printed in block letters above a federal inmate number. I turned it over my hands for a long time before opening it, afraid of what might be inside, bitterness, blame, or worse, silence. Instead, I found something I hadn't expected in a very long time: humility. "Dad," the letter began, "I don't deserve for you to read this, but I'm writing anyway." Mark described his first months behind bars without drama, just blunt details. The early mornings, the noise, the rigid routines. The indignity of being counted like livestock, of waiting in line for everything from meals to phone calls. He mentioned briefly the day he saw his own mugshot flash on the prison television during a news recap and realized, in his words, "I had become the cautionary tale I used to shrug off." "I've had a lot of time to think," he wrote. "In here, nobody cares about your pitch deck or your watch. They care if you can keep your word. Crazy how prison has more honest accounting than my company ever did." He told me about a vocational program he'd joined almost by accident. The waiting list for computer classes was long, so he'd landed in carpentry instead. "The shop supervisor is a guy named Morales," he wrote. "Retired contractor. First day, he slapped my plans for a simple stool on the table and said, 'You draw like a man who thinks the lumber will lie for him.' It hit harder than the judge's gavel. He described sanding boards until his arms shook, measuring twice because Morales would snap at him if he didn't, learning to cut joints that actually fit. 'I kept hearing your voice from the old workshop,' he wrote. 'If it's worth doing right, even when no one sees the backside.' I spent years building facades, Dad. Now I'm literally learning how to build backsides of things." Close to the end, his neat handwriting wavered. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I stole from clients and used your trust like collateral. I treated the house you built as a pawn on my chessboard. You were right to turn me in. I hate saying that, but it's the truth. I needed a wall I couldn't talk my way through." I read that line again and again. Needed a wall he couldn't talk through. "If you're willing," he concluded, "I'd like to see you. Not to ask for anything, just to look you in the eye and say the words I should have said before they put the cuffs on me. I'm sorry, and I was wrong." It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to visit. Walking into that prison was like walking into a world built to erase individuality. Doors clanged. Radios crackled. Visitors shuffled through metal detectors and pat-downs. Every step watched. When Mark walked into the visiting room, wearing khaki and carrying a clear plastic bag with his ID, I barely recognized him. The flashy watch was gone. His hair was cut short. He looked thinner, yes, but more than that, he looked stripped. The layers of swagger he'd worn for years had been peeled away, leaving something raw underneath. "Hi, Dad," he said, voice low. For a moment, we just stared at each other. This new version of my son and the older version of the father he betrayed. Then I stood and hugged him. He stiffened, then clung to me like he had when he was 4 and skinned his knee. We sat across from each other at a plastic table, guards watching from the corners. "I read your letter," I said, "twice." "I meant every word," he replied. "I wish I could say I just got carried away. But the truth is I chose the easy way over and over. I thought I was smarter than everyone, that I could juggle everything forever." He told me more about the carpentry program, how he'd messed up his first set of shelves by rushing, how Morales had made him tear them apart and start again. "It's the only place in here where I feel like I can build instead of destroy," he said, "even if it's just a stool or a simple table. At least it's something that doesn't hurt anyone." "What about the people you did hurt?" I asked gently. "I can't undo that," he replied, eyes wet. "But I'm writing to them. Every single client. I'm not asking forgiveness. I'm just telling them the truth without excuses. I won't pretend it makes things right, but it's a start." I told him then what I'd done with Lila's secret fortune, how I'd covered the restitution shortfalls, so every client got their money back or their promised product, how the company was being dismantled without leaving anyone else holding the bag. He stared at me, stunned. "You did that? After everything? Your mother and I always believed that if we could help fix something we helped break, we should," I said. "You broke it. I helped by ignoring the warning signs. Fixing it is the least I can do." "I don't know how to live with that," he whispered. "With you cleaning up my mess while I sit here." "You live with it by not wasting the second chance it buys everyone," I answered. As the visit time ticked down, he asked one last question. "When I get out, for years or whatever ends up being, is there any version of life where you and I build something honest together? Even if it's just a small repair shop on a side street." I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. "That depends," I said. "Not on the judge, not on me. On who you choose to be every day between now and then. Be the man your mother believed you could be. The rest we'll figure out." Walking back to my car, I realized that justice without any hope of redemption feels like a dead end. But redemption without justice is just another lie. The trick is finding the narrow path between the two. In the next part, you'll see what I ultimately did with Lila's fortune, and how my son and I ended up side by side again, not in a courtroom, but in a place built for second chances. 2 years after that first prison visit, I stood in front of a modest brick building with my name on the sign in a way I never expected to see it. Rowan Skills and Second Chances Center, it read in simple metal letters. Underneath, smaller words. Carpentry. Trades. Digital basics. Life rebuilt. The idea had started as a scribble in the margins of Lila's letter, a phrase she'd written about money being only as meaningful as the lives it helps rebuild. I couldn't shake that line. Paying back Mark's victims had been necessary. But I knew Lila wouldn't have been satisfied with just plugging holes. She would have wanted doors opened. So, with Victor's help and a cautious nod from the financial advisor the bank insisted I meet, I used a large chunk of the fortune to purchase and renovate an old warehouse in a struggling part of town. We turned the ground floor into a woodworking shop and trades training space, rows of workbenches, shelves of tools, stacks of donated lumber. The second floor housed classrooms with donated computers for teaching basic tech, budgeting, resume writing, and small business skills. I didn't want a fancy institute or a slick campus. I wanted a place where people who'd been knocked down by life, bad choices, or bad luck could come and learn how to build something solid, literally and figuratively. When the center finally opened, we focused on older workers who'd been pushed out of their jobs or folks coming home from prison who wanted to do more than just survive. People like my son, though Mark himself was still finishing his sentence when the first class began. Our first group had 12 students. A retired janitor who'd always dreamed of making furniture, a grandmother raising her grandson who needed computer skills, a man in his 50s fresh out of prison who'd never held a smartphone before but could fix anything mechanical. I watched them struggle with their first cuts, their first email accounts, their first hesitant business plans. The shop smelled like sawdust and hope. 3 months after the center opened, Mark walked out of prison gates a free man. He'd served his time with good behavior, and hours logged in the carpentry program. We met him outside, just the two of us, the sky wide and startling after years of concrete ceilings. "You look different," I told him. "So do you," he replied. "Last time I saw you, you were sitting in a plastic chair in a fluorescent room. Now you're the guy opening training centers on the news." I laughed softly. "Your mother always said I'd cause trouble if anyone gave me a budget." I didn't bring him to the old house. That chapter was closed. Instead, I drove him straight to center. He stood in the doorway, taking the rows of benches, the whiteboards covered with diagrams, the older woman frowning in concentration over a laptop while a volunteer guided her. "You built this," he said quietly. "Your mother did. I corrected. I just followed her instructions." Over the next weeks, Mark became a regular presence at the center, first as a helper, then as an instructor. He split his time between a modest job with a construction company willing to give him a chance, and evening classes where he showed students how to design simple projects or navigate online job applications. I watched him sit beside a man in his 60s, guiding his hand as he moved a mouse for the first time. "Don't worry," Mark said, voice patient. "I clicked the wrong thing for years, and I was supposed to be the expert." He taught a younger guy fresh out of jail how to square frame, correcting his grip with a gentle tap instead of sarcasm. When one of the students complained about how long it took to get good at dovetail joints, Mark smiled and said, "Trust me, quick and dirty looks impressive for about 5 minutes. Then everything falls apart." I've lived both sides of that. He never hid his past from them. I ran a company once. He'd tell new students, "Build on shortcuts." Now I build shelves. They don't end up on the news, but they actually hold weight. That honesty made people trust him in a way slick promises never had. Our first graduation ceremony was small. 15 people and a few folding chairs in the workshop, coffee in paper cups, cookies someone's granddaughter had baked. We handed out certificates that weren't accredited by any big institution, but meant the world to the people holding them. One man started a portable repair business. Another grandmother began selling simple handmade benches online with her tech-savvy grandson's help. One former inmate got a job at a cabinet shop that had sworn never to hire anyone with a record until they shook his hand and heard his story. As we locked up that night, Mark ran his hand along a row of freshly built stools. He said, "I used to think success meant scaling up more floors, more screens, more buzz. But this," he gestured around at the modest shop, the chalkboard with crooked writing, "this feels like actually mastering. Success isn't how high you climb." I said, "It's what doesn't collapse when you're done." We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that comes only when enough hard truths have been spoken and survived. I thought again of Lila's letter, her warning about our son, and her hope that I'd use her gift wisely. "I don't know if I deserve the second chance," Mark said softly, "but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of man Mom believed I could be, and the kind of partner you deserve in this place." "Then we're on the right track," I replied, looking at that modest building, those workbenches, the faces of people walking out with calloused hands and lifted heads. I realized something important. Money had been the least valuable part of Lila's secret. The real treasure was a chance to turn pain into purpose. In the final part, I'm going to tell you exactly what I learned from all this, not as a businessman or a victim, but as a grandfather-age man who's seen what greed can do and what grace can repair. And there's a little story I'll tease you with at the end. The next grandpa tale that might sound familiar, but carries a brand new twist. 10 looking back now, as a man close to the end of his life in the beginning, I don't think of this story as one about money or even crime. I think of it as a story about foundations. I spent my life building physical ones, concrete footings, sturdy beams, frames that could carry weight for decades. What I didn't realize until everything fell apart was that our family foundations had cracks I'd painted over instead of repairing. The first lesson I learned is that love without truth is just sentimentality. I love my son so much that I turn away from warning signs my wife clearly saw. I told myself his sharp edges were just drive, his fixation on money just ambition. I laughed off comments that made Lila's eyes darken. By the time I finally looked honestly at what he'd become, he'd turned our home into collateral and our family name into a sales pitch. If you're a parent or grandparent listening to this, don't wait until someone breaks down your door or changes the locks before you ask hard questions. The second lesson is that money doesn't change character. It reveals it. Lila's secret fortune didn't corrupt me because, to me, it never felt like my money. It felt like a responsibility she'd handed me with trembling hands from beyond the grave. In Mark's world, smaller amounts in client accounts became toys, tools to impress and escape. The difference wasn't the number of zeros. It was what we believed that money was for. I chose, finally, to believe Lila, that resources are a tool for protection and repair, not a scoreboard. The third lesson is about justice and mercy. Turning my own son over to the FBI was the hardest decision I've ever made. I've been cut, burned, and knocked flat by falling beams. None of that comes close to watching your child stand in a courtroom while strangers read out the worst things he's ever done. But here's the truth that older men whisper to each other when we talk about our biggest regrets. Sometimes protecting someone means refusing to shield them from consequences. If I'd used Lila's money just to quietly pay off the banks and hide the fraud, the people Mark hurt would have stayed broken, and he would have learned nothing. Justice without mercy is cruel. Mercy without justice is cowardice. The narrow road is holding both, ensuring people are made whole while still leaving the door open for the guilty to become different people than the ones who did the damage. The last and maybe most important lesson is about second chances. Not the fake kind you give someone so you can feel noble while they repeat the same behavior, but the real kind that comes after truth, repentance, and change. When I see Mark teaching a man in his 60s how to send his first email, or showing a woman how to run a saw safely, I don't forget what he did. He doesn't either. It's part of his story now, not erased, but transformed into a warning and a motivation. That's what real second chances look like. They don't pretend the first chance never existed. They build something different on top of the wreckage. These days, when I sit with other men my age at the center, we trade what you might call grandpa stories. Some are funny, some are painful, all of them packed with the kind of wisdom you can't buy, only earned by living through storms. If there's one thing I want to take from mine, it's this. Don't wait for a judge, a bank, or a crisis to force you into honesty. Ask the hard questions now. Have the uncomfortable conversations while there's still time to steer the ship before it hits the rocks. Tell your children and grandchildren that their worth isn't measured in square footage or follower counts, but in the weight their word can carry. And remember, God or fate, or whatever name you give the hand that steadies us, can take even the ugliest chapters and turn them into blueprints for something better, if we're willing to tell the truth about what went wrong. If this story stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share your own second chance stories.